Have you ever found yourself staring at an empty fridge at 6 p.m., desperate, thinking, what am I going to do for dinner? Well, during 27 years of my married life, that was my daily drama. Until I discovered a method that revolutionized my routine. And no, it's not that basic meal planning spreadsheet everyone knows. I'm Margaret, I'm 52 years old, have 3 grown children, and I want to share something I learned after many headaches and tons of wasted food. You know that feeling of guilt when you throw away half a wilted cabbage that was forgotten in the fridge drawer? I used to spend about 1,200 Brazilian reals a month just on wasted food. That's right, you read correctly. When I realized I was literally throwing money in the trash, I decided to create my own system. And look, it has nothing to do with those tips like make a shopping list or plan your meals in advance. It goes far beyond that. My method was born after I noticed an interesting pattern. Our taste buds work in 21-day cycles. Yes, you read that right. After studying my family's eating habits for months, I'm a bit of a nerd about these things. I noticed that preferences repeated every 21 days. This completely changed the way I organize my menu. I started creating what I call the spiral menu. A system that considers not only our preferences but also the energy that each food gives us at different times of the day. For example, I discovered that serving heavier proteins for Monday's lunch was a critical mistake. Everyone would return to work and school with that terrible drowsiness. One of the most surprising discoveries was realizing that certain vegetables have perfect partners, not only in terms of flavor but also for total utilization. When I buy broccoli, for instance, I already know exactly how to use the stem in a recipe on Tuesday and the florets in another on Thursday, without anyone noticing they're eating the same vegetable. I also developed what I call the inverted 15-minute rule. Instead of trying to do everything in 15 minutes, I use that time to prepare ingredients that will serve for 3 or 4 different meals. For example, when I chop onions, I always do this wearing swimming goggles, golden tip. I already separate and season portions in different ways to use throughout the week. The most interesting part is that my method ended up influencing even how I organize other aspects of the house. I realized I could apply the same cyclical principle to organize the laundry, cleaning, and even shopping for hygiene products. It's as if I had discovered a universal pattern for home organization. One of the most rewarding parts of this system is seeing how it adapts to different phases of life. When my children were little, the menu had a certain structure. Now, with them being adults and dining at home only a few days a week, the system has become more flexible but remains equally efficient. Before you think I'm some sort of organizational genius, I must confess, I reached these conclusions after countless mistakes. I remember once trying to implement a system I saw on the internet and ending up with a fridge full of empty glass jars and spoiled food in the trash. It was a disaster that cost me nearly a minimum wage. The secret is not in following rigid rules, but in understanding the natural patterns of your own home. For example, I discovered that Thursday is always the most chaotic day in the kitchen. No matter how hard I try to change that, it's when everyone has different commitments and crazy meal times. That's when I created what I call the chameleon meal. A base dish that can be transformed into 3 or 4 different meals in just minutes. I'll give you a practical example. I make a basic sauté of chicken with vegetables on Wednesday night. On Thursday, that can turn into a wrap for my daughter who gets home late from college, a protein salad for my husband who is watching his health, and an enhanced rice dish for me. Same base, different purposes, 0 waste. A discovery that changed my life was understanding that the temperature of food drastically affects how long we can store it. It seems obvious, but it isn't quite so. I learned that letting food cool naturally before storing it in the fridge not only saves energy but also better preserves the nutrients. I have an infallible trick. I use a marble stone that was just lying around in the backyard as a base to cool pots. It works like a natural heat dissipator. Another thing that nobody talks about is the domino effect of seasonings. You know when you buy that specific spice for a recipe and then it ends up molding in the cupboard? I created a cascade spices system. For example, if I buy saffron for a Monday dish, I already plan recipes for Tuesday and Wednesday that also use that spice, but in completely different ways. That way, nothing sits unused in the cupboard. I also developed what I call the 5 senses method to organize the fridge. Instead of simply stacking containers, I organize them by color, sight, texture, touch, aroma, smell, durability, intuition, and flavor compatibility taste. It may seem excessive, but it reduced my meal preparation time by 40%. One of my most useful inventions was the reverse menu. Instead of planning from the beginning of the week to the end, I start by planning the last meal on Sunday and work backwards. Why? Because I discovered that leftovers and ingredients remaining at the end of the week are usually the hardest to use. When I plan in reverse, I create a much more natural flow of food usage. I remember when I tried to implement those famous tips of preparing all the meal boxes on Sunday, it was a total failure. The food ended up tasting like refrigerator food, nobody wanted to eat the same thing every day, and I spent my entire Sunday in the kitchen. Now, I use what I call progressive prep. I only prepare the basic ingredients and assemble the meals throughout the week. The most interesting thing is how this system ended up affecting my family's eating habits. My husband, who was completely resistant to vegetables, began to appreciate them after I started introducing them strategically in meals. I started by using invisible vegetables, finely grated into dishes he already liked, and gradually increased their presence. One of the most surprising discoveries was the power of aromas in the kitchen. Certain smells can completely change the perception of flavor and even the mood of everyone at home. For example, on Mondays, when everyone comes home a bit grumpy, I always start by preparing something with golden garlic or caramelized onions. The aroma transforms the atmosphere. It's like an olfactory hug after a hard day. I developed a technique that I call progressive aroma. I start with subtler scents in the morning, like coffee and toasted bread, and gradually intensify them throughout the day. In the evening, when everyone is home, that's when I use the more striking aromas. This creates an unconscious ritual that helps mark the moments of the day. One thing that nobody talks about is the importance of the emotional temperature of food. I discovered this when my eldest son was going through a difficult time at work. I noticed that he always cheered up when I prepared dishes reminiscent of his childhood, but with a modern twist. For example, I transformed the traditional pasta with white sauce that he loved into a version with mushrooms and spinach, keeping the comfort of the original, but with a sophisticated touch. Speaking of transformations, I created what I call the weekly wildcard ingredient. Every week, I choose one ingredient that will be the star of various preparations. This week, for example, it's pumpkin. It has already become a cream for a pasta dish, a pancake filling, a creamy soup, and even a brownie, yes, pumpkin brownie, a recipe I developed after much trial and error. This not only saves money but also forces us to be creative in the kitchen. One of my most practical inventions is the chromatic drawer system in the fridge. I organize food by color not only for aesthetics but for practicality. Dark green vegetables are grouped together because they generally have the same shelf life. Orange vegetables as well, and so on. This drastically reduced waste because it became easier to see what needed to be used first. Another interesting discovery was the power of transition moments in meals. You know that period between lunch and dinner, when everyone is looking for something to snack on. I created strategic snack stations throughout the house. In the living room, I leave only lighter, healthier options. In the kitchen, I keep a specific drawer with slightly more substantial options. This helps control eating without creating restrictions. One of the most rewarding parts of this system is seeing how it adapts to different needs. For example, my middle daughter became a vegetarian 2 years ago. Instead of preparing separate meals, I adapted the system to create dishes that can easily transform into versions with or without meat. A mushroom stroganoff, for example, can have chicken added to some portions. I also developed what I call the 3 temperatures method. Instead of serving everything hot or cold, I always try to include 3 different temperatures on the plate. A warm rice dish, room temperature vegetables, and a cold salad, for instance. This not only makes the meal more interesting but also aids digestion. One thing I learned over time is the power of textural contrast. I noticed that meals become much more satisfying when we combine different textures. It's not just a matter of flavor, but of sensory experience. For example, creamy mashed potatoes taste even better with a crunchy little crumble on top. Or a salad gains a whole new dimension when we add some toasted seeds. This led me to create what I call the texture kit. I always keep on hand a few items that can instantly add texture to any dish. Toasted seeds, homemade croutons, made with leftover bread, peanut farofa, and even a savory granola that I invented. It's amazing how a little crunch can completely transform a simple meal. Another thing that revolutionized my kitchen was understanding the concept of anchor flavors. These are those tastes that tie the entire meal together. I discovered that having some intense sauces or pastes ready can save any dish. My basil pesto, for example, is not just for pasta. A spoonful transforms simple grilled chicken or gives new life to steamed vegetables. Speaking of sauces, I developed what I call the modular flavor system. I always have some neutral bases ready, like a basic white sauce or vegetable broth, that can be quickly transformed into various preparations. I add fresh herbs for one flavor, spices for another, cheese for a third. It's like having a wardrobe of flavors. A discovery that surprised me was the power of emotional colors in food. I noticed that on grayer or more stressful days, colorful dishes have a positive impact on everyone's mood. Now, I always try to include at least 3 different colors in each meal. It's not just about nutrition, but about emotional well-being. This led me to create the chromatic menu. Each day of the week has a predominant color that guides my choices. Monday, for example, is Green Day. We start the week with fresh and revitalizing dishes. Friday is Red and Orange Day, warm, energetic colors to celebrate the end of the workweek. One of the most useful techniques I developed is what I call cascade prep. Instead of cooking one dish at a time, I create a flow where preparing one item naturally leads to the next. For example, when I roast vegetables for tonight's dinner, I set aside a portion to use in a quiche tomorrow. The oven is already on, so I take the opportunity to toast some seeds that I will use in salads throughout the week. This made me realize the importance of what I call culinary connection points. These are those moments when one preparation can easily transform into several others. A roasted chicken on Sunday, for example, becomes sandwich filling on Monday, goes into a salad on Tuesday, and ends up in a soup on Wednesday. Each meal naturally and efficiently connects with the next. One of my favorite inventions is the emergency menu. I always keep in the freezer some quick and versatile options that can be turned into complete meals in minutes. They are not ready-made dishes, but strategic components, like frozen rice cakes that can become a quick Asian meal, or a portion of frozen ragu in ice cube trays, perfect for a last-minute pasta dish. The key is that these items are versatile enough to adapt to different preparations. Speaking of versatility, I developed the concept of chameleon ingredients. These are those items that can completely change personality depending on how they're prepared. Chickpeas, for example, can be the base for creamy hummus, become crispy falafel, or be added to a cold salad. Keeping some of these ingredients on hand greatly expands the possibilities of the menu without complicating shopping. A technique that has worked wonders is what I call the overnight marinade. Before going to bed, I set aside the protein I will use the next day and let it marinate. I use different combinations of herbs, spices, and acids, like lemon or vinegar, depending on what I plan to prepare. This not only saves time the next day but also results in much deeper and more interesting flavors. Another fascinating discovery was the power of thermal contrast in meals. I realized that including something cold in a hot dish, or vice versa, not only makes the experience more interesting but also aids digestion. A simple example is adding a spoonful of cold yogurt to a hot vegetable soup. The contrast in temperatures awakens the senses and makes the meal more satisfying. I also developed what I call the gradual transformation method. Instead of introducing new foods or flavors all at once, I make gradual changes over several weeks. For example, when I wanted to include more whole grains in the family's diet, I started by mixing a small amount of brown rice with white rice, gradually increasing the proportion. After a few weeks, we were eating 100% whole grains without any resistance. One of my favorite strategies is the retroactive menu. Instead of planning from the beginning to the end of the week, I start from the end. I think about what I want to serve on Sunday and work backwards, creating connections between meals. This helps me use ingredients more efficiently and drastically reduces waste. Speaking of waste, I created the Forgotten Drawer Challenge. Once a week, I prepare a meal using only items that are hidden at the back of the fridge or cupboard. It's amazing how this stimulates creativity and makes us rediscover forgotten ingredients. A technique that has been successful in my home is what I call the deconstructed meal. Instead of serving a fully assembled dish, I place the components separately on the table, allowing everyone to assemble their own plate as they prefer. This not only makes the meal more interactive but also caters to different preferences and dietary restrictions without having to prepare separate dishes. Finally, one of the most valuable lessons I learned is about the importance of the meal ritual. No matter how simple the menu is, I always try to create a special moment around the food. It can be as simple as lighting a candle or using beautiful napkins. I realized that when we treat a meal as a special moment, even if brief, it completely changes the way we relate to the food and to each other. Implementing all these strategies took time and a lot of experimentation, but the result was transformative. Not only did we save time and money, but we also significantly improved our relationship with food and with one another. The kitchen stopped being a place of stress and became the beating heart of our home, a space of creativity, connection, and love. I hope some of these ideas can inspire you to find your own rhythm in the kitchen. Remember, the secret is not in following rigid rules, but in discovering what works for you and your family. Organizing your menu is a journey, not a destination. So, have fun experimenting, adapting, and above all, savoring every moment of this delicious culinary adventure.